In this video, I'm going to explain how to set up the Fujifilm X-T3 so that you can use old vintage lenses, and I'm also going to talk through all the manual focus assist options that the X-T3 has to enable you to focus quickly and accurately. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about in terms of lenses are vintage manual focus lenses that have a built-in aperture ring. Now, there are autofocus mount adapters out there, and there are new ones coming to the market almost every day now, but I'm going to try and look at those in another video in the future. So for now, we're just talking about manual focus, manual aperture vintage lenses. Now, just like any other mirrorless camera, when you mount a vintage lens on the Fujifilm X-T3, the first thing you're going to need is one of these, a mount adapter. Now, essentially, it's just a metal tube with a Fujifilm X mount at the rear to mount on the camera, and then at the other end is your chosen mount. So this one, for example, is actually a Nikon F mount. There, just fits this old 50mm f1.4 lens. Now, you can obviously get adapters in a huge variety of different mounts, and the good news is that a pretty basic one shouldn't cost any more than around about £20. There are obviously some more premium ones on the market, and they're more accurately made, perhaps a little better built, but for the most part, the cheaper ones should do just fine for most people. So now we've got the lens mounted onto the adapter, all we do is simply put it on the camera like we would any other lens, simple as that. But there is one more thing that we need to do before we are able to take pictures with the X-T3, and that is because there's no electronic communication, but obviously between the lens and the adapter and the camera. So the X-T3 doesn't actually know that we've got a lens attached, and by default the shoot without lens setting is actually switched off. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is obviously switch that on, and to do that you need to go into the setup menu and then jump to the button and dial settings, scroll through to screen 2 of 3, and then change shoot without lens from off to on. And then once you've done that, you should be able to fire the shutter and begin taking your images. Now, there is another useful setting that you can change, which is found in the shooting setting menu on screen 2, and that is the mount adapter setting. Now, in here you can change the focal length of the lens, and then it adds this information to the metadata of any images that you take with that particular lens whilst that setting is on. Now, this can help you later on when it comes to applying lens corrections in raw conversion software. So if you've got a specific profile for the lens and you've created that, all you need to do is in your software look for all of the images that you've taken with this lens in the metadata, and then you can just universally apply that lens correction to it. Now, if you use Fujifilm's own X mount to Leica M mount adapter, there is an option to actually select a few lens corrections that you can choose and then apply them, and the camera then will remember those corrections for that particular Leica lens and apply them each time you choose that focal length in the mount adapter setting. And they're pretty basic corrections, but for the rest of us, without a load of Leica lenses and without that Fujifilm adapter, we'll have to make do with just changing any corrections we need to do in software later. All of those options are actually greyed out if you aren't using that particular Fujifilm adapter. One thing to mention probably at this stage is that obviously we've got no in-camera stabilization in the X-T3, so it's really important to make sure you choose an appropriate shutter speed. Now, probably best to use the old rule of thumb, which was select the shutter speed that best matches or closest matches the 35mm film equivalent lens. So here I've got a 50mm lens, but it's on the X-T3, which has an APS-C size sensor, so it's the equivalent field of view as a 75mm lens on a full frame or 35mm camera. So I need to be using a shutter speed of either 1/60th or 1/80th of a second. Now, I'd probably err on the side of caution and I'd go for 1/80th, particularly in all these days of pixel peeping and looking at images at 100%. But really, what shutter speed you choose is obviously going to depend on how steady you can hold the camera and lens combination. But roughly stick to that rule and you should be okay. Let's crack on with the manual focusing features. So first up, the magnified view. Like virtually every other mirrorless camera, we can view a magnified view when we're manually focusing, which will help us really precisely and accurately focus. You can select this by either pushing in the dial on the back, and here also you can jump between two different levels of magnification, or you can just double tap the rear screen. Now there's various function buttons on the camera, so you can assign that magnified view to any of those, including sort of this one on the front here or that one up there, but it's by default set to that dial, and it's naturally works well because once you're in that view you can use the dial, like I say, to jump in a magnification level. Now there are also a few other features in the X-T3 and other Fujifilm cameras that will help you manually focus, and these can all be found under Manual Focus Assist in the Autofocus and Manual Focus Settings menu. Now the first of these is called Digital Split Image. This uses the phase detection area of the sensor to show us what the left and right side of the sensor is seeing, and it forms then a series of alternating stripes. Now by manually focusing the lens and aligning those stripes, we can get the image into focus. Essentially, this is actually what the camera is doing when it autofocuses using phase detection. Now, Digital Split Image is a very cleverly developed manual focus assist tool, and it works really well when you've got scenes that have got quite clear lines and shapes that are going to be easy to align. Usefully, it can also be used in the magnified view, which means again you can get a very precise kind of fine tuning with that mode. So next up is a feature that is currently exclusive to the Fujifilm X-T3, and that is the digital micro prism. It kind of presents a kind of checkerboard look in a circle in the center of the image, and what you have to do is, once again, like the split image, kind of align all of those different squares until they are sharp and in focus. It works really well again with the magnified view. Now I like the micro prism option as it reminds me of using a vintage SLR, and that's lovely when you're using a vintage lens and you've got a camera like the X-T3 with all of these buttons and dials and just the shape and size of the camera. But for me, it's not quite as easy to manually focus as quickly and accurately as when you're using the digital split image option. So I kind of like the feature for what it offers in terms of adding to the appeal and experience of using the X-T3 from that kind of vintage standpoint. But for me, the fastest way to manually focus has still got to be focus peaking. Now, most photographers should be familiar with focus peaking by now. Basically, the camera is looking for areas of the image with extremely fine contrast, and then it just highlights those edges. And it's those edges that are going to be in focus, basically, because of that contrast. Now, the downside is that it does require edges to be there. So if you're taking a portrait, for example, you might be able to tell that the eye is in focus and you might see some focus peaking around there, but on areas of skin you're not going to have any sort of sharp edges where it can actually detect contrast. Shouldn't be too much of a problem with portraits because you want the eye to be in focus, but hopefully you get the idea. Basically, focus peaking for most types of photography is probably going to be the fastest way to manually focus. Now in the X-T3's menu, we've got 4 different color options for focus peaking. Personally, I choose red as it just stands out the most when I'm shooting landscapes, but it can also be a little bit distracting because it's very bright and bold. I think it's best, obviously, to choose the color that works well for you and for what you're photographing. Now within focus peaking, you've also got high and low options. Now the low option tends to be a little bit more discerning. It highlights less edges, but it can also be a little bit more difficult to see sometimes. But when I see them, I trust that those are the edges that are indeed in focus. Now the high setting will show you more edges that are a little bit in focus, and it's good if you want to focus quickly and you're confident enough that you've got a large enough depth of field to cover any slight kind of misalignment in the focus. It's a good option for things like street photography where you need to be quick, or perhaps where you're shooting from the hip. You can almost use it like a rangefinder. You can look at the focus peaking and see, oh, roughly that area is going to be in focus, and you can kind of fire away. Now, if you're shooting in black and white and you're doing street photography, even better if you're using that red, because it's really pronounced. You can really see it against a sort of monochrome image on the screen. So that's my very quick guide to photographing vintage lenses on the X-T3 and all the manual focus settings that can help you get the most out of these lenses. If you enjoyed this video, we put out first looks, reviews, technique videos around about once a week. So if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, stay up to date with all the latest photo gear news and reviews.